Neal Bascomb, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So you spent a lot of your career writing books about war, specifically World War II. In your book, The Perfect Mile, you take a look at the epic race to break the 4-minute mile. I'm curious, what led you to write about this story? Was there some kind of World War II connection there, or was it just an interest of yours that you had?
No, actually, Perfect Mile was the second book that I ever wrote, but actually before I started writing about war. And my inspiration for it was basically from high school. I was a high school cross-country runner, and my coach suggested to all his runners, really not really a suggestion, ordered us to read Bannister's memoir, The 4-Minute Mile, Roger Bannister's memoir. And I was absolutely blown away by it. It sort of gave me sort of added impetus to run and to try to push myself. And later in as I started my writing career, I looked back to that story and saw that no one had really done a history of really the whole story about the breaking of the 4-minute mile, that it was more than just Roger Bannister's story, but it was a story about three men, all in their early 20s, trying to achieve this landmark record.
So before we get to these three men, let's talk about the backstory of this, of the 4-minute mile record. How long had people been trying to break a 4-minute mile before these three guys started doing it in Gusto in the 1950s?
Well, it dates back quite a bit, actually. I mean, as early as 1770, a runner said that he had run the 4-minute mile down London's Old Street. There was no official record of that, and it's very likely a myth. But probably in the late 1800s, the mile and this sort of idea of achieving a 4-minute mile really came to fore. There was what was called at that time the Mile of the Century by two brothers who were competing against each other in West London. And they got the record down to 4 minutes and 18 seconds. And then as the 20th century hit, you find that the tracks are improving, stopwatches are improving as well. And this idea of running 4 laps, 4 quarter miles in 4 minutes, the sort of perfect balance of that, really captivated people, and runners began chipping away towards the 4-minute mile. So Paavo Nurmi, the Finnish runner, got it down to 4:10 in 1937. Sidney Wooderson got it down to 4:06, and then two Swedes in the sort of World War II years knocked that down to basically 4 minutes and 1 second. And then that's where it stood, and people thought or believed in many ways that 4 minutes was an achievement that simply wasn't possible.
Yeah, you even had physiologists chiming in on this. What did they think would happen if a man did run a minute or run a mile under 4 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say physiologists, probably the good ones, would not go to the hyperbole that many went to. But my book opens up with the statement that men thought that people would die if they ever attempted to reach 4 minutes, that the heart, that the lungs simply didn't have the capacity for it. And so there was this barrier, both sort of, I think, physiologically, but probably more psychologically, that it was an impossible achievement.
So why is the 4-minute mile such a hard feat? I mean, what makes it different from, say, an 800-meter sprint or a 5K?
Well, I think the mile, and milers say this, but I think, track coaches and many people who are sort of intimately involved in the sort of running world consider the mile the kind of perfect combination, perfect balance between speed and endurance. You need both of those to become an expert miler. So if you're a marathoner, endurance is what you need foremost. If you're a sprinter doing a 100-yard dash, speed is what you need most. But if you're going to run a mile under 4 minutes, you need to both be able to sustain incredible amounts of speed over a fair amount of distance. If you ever try, in fact, to come close to what a 4-minute mile is, I would suggest running on a treadmill and knocking it down the speed until you're as fast as you can go. And that's probably about a 5-minute mile. And your legs are just going like crazy So you can imagine what improving that speed by 20-25% is about.
And how are people training for this before these three characters you follow in the book started really gunning for it? Were they scientific about it, or were they just like, just run as hard as I can until I can't anymore?
Yeah, I mean, the training at this time was not particularly advanced. I think the big training movement that really sort of ramped up speed subsequent to these events are 2-a-day training sessions. At this point in time, people weren't using coaches really that much. They were running once a day. They were doing limited intervals, and they were basically, in some respects, just running long distances and hoping that would improve their times. There was a runner named Neal Bascomb who, at this period of time, was beginning to sort of train in a more modern way, but Bannister and these others who were racing to break the 4-minute mile, when they started, they were really training under sort of rudimentary methods at best.
Right. And what I also love about this book, besides telling the story of these three characters, is how you describe what sport was like during this time in the early part of the 20th century, particularly running. How is it different than from what it is today?
Well, I think the fundamental difference is this idea of the amateur athlete, the ethos of that, the idea that, at this time that, again, coaches were scorned, running and competition and athletics was about fun and about the effortlessness of it. There's this anecdote which I love particularly. There was an Oxford sprinter, a guy named Bevel Rudd, and just to give you an idea of what people considered an athlete should be or how they should approach their sport. He was a sprinter. He arrived at a quarter-mile race with a cigar chomping in his mouth. He put it down on the side of the track. He ran his sprint. He won. He picked up the still smoking cigar, stuck it back in his mouth, and sauntered away from the track. That is an extreme example of what, the sort of amateur, effortless athletic runner was about, but it gives you an idea of the world that these people were living in at the time.
So it wasn't like today where like you have athletes who dedicate 24/7 to training for their sport. Like the amateur athletes strive to have a well-balanced life, and sport was just one of many things they did.
Yeah, sport was one of many things. It was not a career. It was not something that they endeavored to make money off of. They thought that they would run in their early 20s and then they would go off and pursue a career. Often they were studying at the same time, and there just was no expectation that this was more than just a sort of intense hobby.
And this was particularly a British ethos, correct? Like a United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the British exemplified this the best. I think the Americans, in sort of typical American fashion, were exceeding and sort of professionalizing what running and athletics was. But even in the United States, and one of the principal characters in the story, Wes Santee, was bedeviled by this, I think, evolving world between amateur athletics and what sport was to become, which was professional athletics. And it's one of the reasons, again, I wrote this book. I just felt it was this particularly nice moment in sport where the sort of last of the great amateur athletes achieves a sort of landmark record. I think subsequent to that world sort of slipped away from us.
And also what's interesting, this is going on, the race for the 4-minute mile or the sub 4-minute mile was going on at the same time when this other sort of amateur idea of the amateur adventurer. So you had people trying to scale Mount Everest and doing all these other epic things. It was kind of it was catching that same sort of vein, and it was sort of the last of the amateur adventures as well.
Yeah, it was this idea. I mean, Edmund Hillary, who was in the I hate to use this word, but I will, the milieu of Roger Bannister and these others, these men who consider themselves adventurers, explorers, pushing both sort of not only the sort of personal records, but also great achievements.
So let's talk about these characters specifically. Everyone probably knows Roger Bannister, so we'll save him for last. Let's talk about, you mentioned Wes Santee. There were 3 individuals. Wes Santee was one of them. He was an American, but tell us more about his background and how he approached breaking the sub 4-minute mile.
So Wes Santee was the American, one of the three in the story, all trying to achieve the 4 minute mile at the same time. He was, from a small town, Kansas farm, an awful guy who beat Wes pretty terribly whenever he tried to sort of perform his sport growing up. His father wanted him to work the farm. He didn't want him to be interested in athletics or anything like that. Didn't want him to run. And running for Wes Santee was his way out of that world, away from the farm. He was recruited to the University of Kansas by the great track coach there, Bill Easton, and became very quickly the greatest miler in America by great strides. And Wes was quite a bit of a character. He was very brash. He loved the glamour, loved the press. He was considered the quote unquote Dizzy Dean of the Cinders. He would approach the track. He would say, I'm going to run this time, like Babe Ruth, kind of pointing to the stands where he's going to hit the home run. And then he'd run that exact time. And he was competing both for the university and then also trying to achieve the Olympics in 1952. And I think one of the sort of foundations of this story is that all three of these individuals competing for this, Roger Bannister, Wes Santee, and then John Landy, all had approached the 52 Helsinki Olympics hoping and believing that they would win or at least place in the medal, and none of them did. And so by the end of that Olympics, they were rearing to go to try to sort of prove themselves. And the mile was the way that they were going to do that. Breaking the 4 minute mile was in some ways redemption for all three of these runners. And for Wes, who was still competing for the University of Kansas and was running races almost on a weekly basis, not only running the mile, but even longer distances, he was just sort of constantly running and competing. And he was, although he was shooting for the 4 minute mile, he also had the responsibilities of so many other things. And that's in sort of very stark contrast to the two other runners, Bannister and Landy, who were much more focused on simply breaking the 4 minute mile. That was their ambition. That was the focus of all their efforts. And so in some ways, Santee was handicapped by the sort of constant running and constant racing as opposed to the two others.
So you mentioned earlier that Santee was sort of bedeviled by this transition from sort of amateur athletics to the professionalization of the sport. I mean, how did that play out in his life and in his running career? Any examples of that?
It did not play out well for Wes Santee. I mean, Wes was, and I met and interviewed all three of these gentlemen over the course of writing the book. And, even in his 70s, Wes was still sort of heartbroken over what happened to him in this period of time. Basically, amateur athletics in the United States, a lot of people were making money except for the athletes themselves. You sort of almost can sort of draw a line to what's happening in college athletics, college football, and the like, where you have this world in many ways exploiting these athletes. And Wes, who was not a shy individual, pushed up against that and was offered, travel money basically to go to different events across the country. And because he was so brash, because he was so in your face, I think the athletic community in the U.S. was intimidated or afraid, or in some ways wanted to sort of knock him down off that stool. And they essentially did that over the course of the 1954 and ultimately ended up banning him from racing right at the sort of crux or the most important moments of breaking the 4 minute mile, where he didn't end up getting his chance.
And the organization you're talking about here is the AAU, correct?
Correct.
So you mentioned earlier, so I'm guessing Santee never broke the 4 minute mile, correct?
So Santee never broke the 4 minute mile. He came within 30 seconds of it, but that was as close as he ever got. And I think a combination of overrunning, overcompeting, coupled with the AAU controversy, which eventually forced him out of the sport, kept him from achieving it.
And what did he do after his running career was over?
After his running career, he ended up selling insurance across Kansas, and then, made a career of that, raised a family. But again, when I met him in Kansas in 2002, I believe, he still talked very emotional about his father. In some ways, he was still a bit of an open wound about what happened to him about the 4 minute mile and the AAU expulsion.
So let's move over to John Landy. He was an Australian runner. How did being a runner from Australia disadvantage him, or maybe how did that disadvantage perhaps give him an edge as well?
Well, I think that the disadvantage for Landy, at least in Australia, was the sort of lack of focus on running, the running culture there. Growing up, running and competing in athletics was not necessarily something that a young Melbourne boy would aspire to be. Landy came from a sort of middle-class background, nice family. He loved to chase butterflies. He came to running late in his life, or late in his, teens, but found that he had this sort of amazing, at this period, ability to sort of push himself to compete out of almost sheer will. And he was eventually recruited to join a sort of band of merry runners, as I sort of look at it, led by this kind of guru, I guess is the best way of explaining him. Or he was a bit of a freak, but he knew running very well, a man named Percy Cerruti. And he was a short guy. He was about 5'2", Cerruti, and he ran barefoot. He ran around town in Melbourne, shirtless, wearing these very small shorts, and recruited Landy and a bunch of other runners to train them to be the best. And he had these sort of outlandish methods. Not only was running barefoot sort of part of that, but running up and down sand dunes, running through nature, living off a vegetarian root-based diet, considered running kind of the best way of saying it, sort of as an art, as an expression of art. And Landy thrived under that for a while because it was fun, and it was something where he found himself on a team and was sort of pushing and getting better and better. But ultimately, Cerruti did not believe that will, or running more and more, was the way to achieve and to get better. And Landy, at a certain point, decided that he could train himself and he could push himself harder and longer than anybody else. And so you have Landy, I think of all three runners, probably the one who trained the most, who trained the hardest, was running, hours and hours at night after school, and really ground himself down and pushed himself, and probably I'd say was the best conditioned runner of the three of these challengers to the 4 minute mile.
Yeah, when I was reading about Landy's coach, it reminded me of sort of like kind of the paleo movement that you see
exactly
today, right?
Yes. And imagine that in 1954, right? So that was not de rigueur.
And so you mentioned Landy, after he broke, he got more intense with his training. Did his style of running change after he broke from his coach that allowed him to, give him an edge in his running?
No, I wouldn't say his style of running changed dramatically. His stride changed a little bit. He, the barefoot running helped augment that. But it was for Landy, it was really about putting in the miles, about keeping a notebook and writing, okay, today I went 8 miles in the morning. I did this speed. Tomorrow I'm going to do 9 miles, and then just ramping that up all on his own without any great interval training or sort of scientific methods about it, just sheer putting on the miles to improve. And it did wonders. He became the greatest Australian miler at the time, and steadily chipped down at the 4-minute mile and got very close to being the first person to break it.
And you mentioned that he while he didn't have a coach, he did look at how some of the other runners were training. I guess he took a lot of inspiration from those Finnish guys, right, that were doing really well in the Olympics.
He did, particularly from Santee, who we met at Helsinki Olympics, and took away some of those interval training methods. But again, all sort of notes, no kind of rigorous schedule that we have today, where you're going to do 2 minutes hard bursts and then 15 seconds off and at this heart rate and at this level of effort. It was just, he was experimenting by feel more than anything else.
So let's move to Bannister. So he was from England. What was his philosophy towards running and athletics in general?
Yeah, I mean, Bannister was the archetypal amateur athlete. He was a conservative guy. He was quiet. He was cerebral. He was born in Harrow, England. Loved running from a sort of very early age. I think one of his sort of crystalline memories is running on a beach as a child, and that sort of freedom of movement. He writes beautifully about that in his memoir about running. But I think above and beyond anything else, a love of running, I think what you had in Bannister was just an absolute killer in terms of competitive will. I mean, meeting him years ago, the intensity of his eyes, the intensity with which he spoke of these races, almost 50 years later, was absolutely remarkable. And so Bannister, as the amateur athlete, although he wanted to be the best, he also wanted to pursue his career. And so at this time of the training, he was training to break the 4-minute mile. He was studying to become a doctor. He was interning at St. Mary's Hospital. He attended Oxford. So he was, achieving this sort of excellence in medicine to become a neurologist, while at the same time trying to break this record. And so he had very little time to do that. He was training, at lunchtime, at best a half hour, walking to the track near the hospital and putting in his time, and then going back and seeing patients. He was, again, this supreme example of the amateur athlete, at least at the beginning of this story. That subsequently sort of evolved as he got closer and closer to 4 minutes.
Yeah, so you mentioned Landy. His training was sort of experimentation, trial and error. But Bannister, with his medical background, he kind of got scientific with how to best approach breaking the 4-minute mile, and he researched it. Like I guess he developed this contraption to test VO2 max, correct?
Yeah, he was testing VO2 max. He was testing lactic acid in his muscles. He had built this treadmill in the lab at school, and he would put himself on that thing and hook himself up and run as fast as he could, and then hop off and take blood samples and then do it again, and really trying to see from a scientific level what was possible, what was physiologically possible, and how to sort of push himself to a higher level. He experimented on his friends, Chris Brasher and Chris Chataway, and other people. He was running a sort of scientific experiment in some ways on the 4-minute mile. And I think for a period of time that overwhelmed him, in the sense that he was approaching this from a purely sort of mental level. And I think, again, as the story evolved, he had to sort of embrace that sort of love of running, which I think Santee probably exemplified more than anybody else, and that sort of will that John Landy sort of exemplified probably more than anybody else. Bannister in many ways needed to sort of combine those sort of will, love of running, and the sort of mental breakdown of what was absolutely necessary to break 4 minutes.
And what's also interesting about Bannister, so he started off like Landy. Well, no, he started off training by himself. But unlike Landy, who later, he started off with a coach, but then broke off by himself, Bannister, as he got closer and closer to breaking the 4 minute mile, he actually got a coach and started working with other people to help him do this thing. He realized he couldn't do it by himself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was the significant moment for Bannister. So you have 1952, the Helsinki Olympics, the failure there. Bannister particularly was slated to win a medal, and so he comes back, and all through 1953, he's running on his own and getting slightly better, but not to the level that he needs to. And so finally, his friends, Chris Chataway and Chris Brasher, and a coach, Franz Stampfel, who again was beginning to sort of pursue running in a much more sort of rigorous, new methods, new interval training and the like, and really getting Bannister to sort of push himself past the point where he thought he would break. I think that was what Stampfel did as a coach for Bannister. I think Bannister wasn't willing to sort of push himself to that point, and Stampfel was the one who got him there.
So let's talk about the race in which Bannister finally beat the 4 minute mile. When did that happen? And did he, was he expected to do that? He thought he was going to do it that day, or was there sort of some hemming and hawing before then?
Well, I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, Bannister, again, unlike Santee, who was racing time and time again to break 4 minutes, Bannister took a much more measured approach to it and decided that if he was going to achieve this, he would have to pick a date, pick a time where he was at the absolute supreme level of his conditioning, and also to do that race with pacers, with people, again, his friends Chataway and Brasher, who were both runners, to, in some ways, push him along the track as pacers to bring him to the level where he could push past 4 minutes. To say that better, Bannister took this as a team approach. He knew he couldn't do it alone on the track by himself. He needed someone to chase after and to push himself. And so he organized this race on May 6, 1954 at Iffley Road Track at Oxford, a track that he knew very well. And his two pacers would go out before him and he would follow them around and then ultimately leave them behind to break 4 minutes.
And it's funny, you said that, you kind of mentioned this in the book, that the fact that he used pacers put a metaphorical asterisk next to his achievement.
No, I definitely think it did in some ways. I mean, at least in many people's eyes, the fact that he did not compete in a race and do it, that he had people pushing and in some ways he was drafting off of them around the track, did not make it legitimate. My point of view on that is that's bullocks. And, he ran 4 minutes. No one had ever done it. He did it on the track. He didn't have some sort of special shoes or an extreme gusty wind at his back on a straight. He ran it around the track on a sort of dim, dark day and managed it and achieved something that was remarkable. But I don't think that was the end of the story. The reason that my book is called The Perfect Mile is because I don't consider the breaking of the 4 minute mile at Iffley Road on May 6th to be Bannister's ultimate achievement. I think it was beating 4 minutes at a race against the best in the world, which he did subsequent to that.
Right. So the best in the world was John Landy, who broke the 4 minute mile after Bannister. How long after Bannister broke the 4 minute mile did Landy break it?
Landy broke it on June 21st, 1954. So, roughly six and a half weeks after Bannister did it. And it's interesting because Landy, who had come the closest prior to Bannister, had essentially given up in some ways. I mean, he had told the press that he felt like he had hit a brick wall, that there was no faster that he could go. And yet, after Bannister broke it, I think I think in many ways the psychological barrier was broken. And Landy in Finland at a race not only broke 4 minutes, but beat Bannister's time by almost a minute and a half. I mean, almost a second and a half, which is remarkable.
All right, so Landy breaks it. Santee is sort of out because he has to join the Marines, and that kind of ended his career. You talk about the perfect mile, this race, this showdown between Bannister and Landy. How big of a cultural event was this at the time? Did it sort of captivate world audiences?
So the 4 minute mile itself, this race that Bannister sort of started off by announcing that he was going to break 4 minutes, and this battle between he and Bannister, battle between Bannister, Landy, and Santee captivated the world and brought a tremendous amount of front page news attention to this, not only to the mile, but to athletics. And so once Bannister broke it, again, worldwide headline news. And then suddenly in August of 1954, you have Bannister and Landy, the two men in the world who had broken 4 minutes, now facing off against each other in a race. And so that just drew the attention of sports writers and newspapers and radio broadcasters and the like. It was an international event that drew a tremendous amount of attention. And in some ways, as I write in the book, is that was sort of the beginning of this evolution from amateur to professional athletics. This idea, this level of attention, this media presence at the Commonwealth Games for this epic race in August in Vancouver between Bannister and Landy.
And going into the race, who was favored to win it? Was it Landy because he had won, he broke the 4 minute mile while actually racing, or was Bannister favored?
I think that largely depends on what newspapers you were reading. If you were reading the London press, they were sure Bannister was going to win, and if you were reading the Melbourne press, the alternate would be the case. But from my perspective, at least, Landy was the faster runner. He was suffering a little bit from a cold in Vancouver, but he was, he had been competing over the course of this story, so he had more sort of experience in some ways on that level. He was clearly in better shape, and in many ways, I thought a faster runner. So if I could sort of draw back in time and look at this without knowing what was going to happen, I probably would have bet on Landy. He was the kind of runner who always sort of went off like a jackrabbit from the start and kept and maintained the lead throughout the race. That was the kind of runner he was, and he just ran away with race after race. And so compared to Bannister, who in some ways, was still not training at the level anywhere near what Landy was doing, and had been beaten by a second and a half in terms of time. And so that's pretty dramatic difference.
And what made the race more dramatic too, people at the time didn't know this, that Landy before the race stepped on some flash bulb from a photographer and sliced his foot open before the race.
Yeah, he had had a cold and had this injury on his foot, but speaking to Landy about it, and maybe he was just being a gentleman. Many years later, he said that had no significant impact at all on his running that day, and I think that's probably the case. I think pure adrenaline would have obviated that injury, although it was, in some ways serious. His foot was sort of blood soaked at the end of the race.
So what allowed Bannister to win? Do you think he just dug deep and just tapped into that will, that competitive killer instinct to win in that final kick?
I think it absolutely was about Bannister and his killer instinct. It drew back to what I said earlier about him. He was a killer. He was a competitive monster. He needed to win. He had to win. And he was very smart about it. He let Landy, lead off. He let Landy sort of, in some ways, expire himself a little bit. And then out of sort of sheer will and killer instinct, he sort of drew himself closer and closer to Landy as they went. into the final stretch of the race. And I think so, sort of most famously, and there's even a statue of this in Vancouver, Landy looked over his shoulder to see where Bannister was, knowing very well that he was coming up close on his heels. And that split second of turning and that loss of momentum in his legs was the exact moment that Bannister put on his final kick. And it was more than enough to not only beat Landy, but also to break the 4-minute mile again.
So what did Landy and Bannister do after this perfect race? How did they spend the rest of their careers?
So Bannister largely abandoned running subsequent to the Empire Games. He retired. He went on to become what he always wanted to be, a neurologist, a quite successful one, and was practicing medicine, for decades afterwards, and was a fairly well-renowned neurologist. Landy actually ran in the subsequent Olympics, did not do terribly well, but his probably sort of most famous incident after this 4-minute mile episode was when he, at the Olympics, sort of stopped to rescue or to help another runner on the track, and then went on to win the race, even after the delay of helping another runner get up and back to his feet. So Landy was very much a beloved figure in Australia. He became a businessman. And then when he retired, he eventually ended up becoming the governor of Victoria, a sort of ceremonial post, kind of the sort of head of state of that particular area of Australia.
So yeah, it sounds like a lot of they kind of moved on with their life. It sounds like.
I think the only one who didn't move on with his life was Wes Santee. When I met him, he was at that time serving as kind of I guess the best way to put it is a condolence mourner at a funeral parlor, which is a sort of sad place to sort of spend your days. But again, he constantly spoke of what happened in the 4-minute mile with a great deal of regret.
So what's the record for the mile now, and what's the threshold that everyone's gunning for now? So
the record for the mile now is 3 minutes, 43 seconds and some change, I think, owned by a Moroccan, El Garouche. And he's held that record since 1999. So no one's sort of chipped away at it since then. And I think in some ways the mile isn't quite what it used to be. I think the metric system is in some ways sort of taken dominance in the 1,500 meter race, which is the Olympic race, is really what middle distance runners are running now and aiming to achieve. And so the mile has sort of lost some of the glamour that it had in those days in 1954.
Are there people still gunning for it though? Like, are there people like, I'm a miler? That's what they say they are.
Yes, I mean, I think particularly in America, probably there's more of this idea of being a miler and sort of breaking 4 minutes, which in some ways is now the sort of standard to become a competitive miler, is to actually break 4 minutes, but to actually chip it down to 3:40 or 3:30, no one's come close. I think most of the attention right now is on running, at least breaking barriers, is that 2-hour marathon.
So after writing about these three men, did you take away any lessons from them on living a good life? And do you think they should serve as models for athletes today?
I think it's probably impossible for this idea of the most elite athletes in the world to be pure amateurs. I think that day is lost. But I think, at least from my perspective, from someone who enjoys running and enjoys sport, I think the idea of doing it for the pure sake of enjoyment is something that sort of I took away from this book. And I still go on runs these days where they're shorter every year, but where I have this moment where I'm, my most recent one was down in Mexico on this sort of abandoned beach where I ran for miles and then into the hills. And I remember stopping and being, having this sort of exalted moment where, running was sort of beauty and it was just pure and it was just for the sake of it, not for exercise, not for anything else. And that's something that I think that Santee and Landy and Bannister all had in their own way. So that's one thing that I sort of drew from their sort of experiences over the course of the story. And I think the other one was kind of what it takes to achieve the impossible. This idea, and this is a simplification, but this idea that Santee sort of ran from his heart throughout his life. Landy ran from out of pure will, and Bannister sort of approached it in the cerebral from his head. And I think that the way that Bannister was able to break 4 minutes first, and the way that he was able to win at the Empire Games, was this ability finally to sort of combine that sort of heart, will, and mind. And that's something that I see over and over in other aspects or other histories that I write about people doing pretty remarkable things.
Well, Neal, this has been a great conversation, and I really recommend people go get the book, because the way you write it and tell the story, like you're like on bated breath, and see how things turn out, even though you know how.
That's very sweet of you to say.
Even though you know how it's going to turn out, you're still you get pumped up. Where can people go to learn more about your work and your book?
Sure. So they can. My books are available in pretty much everywhere they sell books. Or you can also, love for you to come to the website. That's www.nealbascomb.com, NEALBASCOMB.com.
Awesome. Well, Neal Bascomb, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
That's been awesome. Thank you.
My guest today was Neal Bascomb. He's the author of the book, The Perfect Mile. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. Also, head over to his site, nealbascomb.com, to learn more about his work. He's written a lot of great stuff on World War II. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/perfectmile, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.